So let me welcome today's speaker, Tom Beeks, who's a trainer at the Bell Foundation, and I think many of you might know him or have seen or met him before. In today's webinar, Tom will explore what inclusive practice looks like in the context of international school EAL provision. And if there's time at the end, Tom will take any questions that you might have. So feel free to use the chat or the Q&A box to send any questions as they come to you. I will collect them during the webinar and then ask them to Tom at the end. And in the next couple of days, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording of this webinar and also links to any resources that Tom will be mentioning today. But enough introductions, over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Shaka. Hi, I'm Tom. I'm one of the trainers here at the Bell Foundation, and I'm going to be talking about organising inclusive EAL provision and how we can make that happen within our schools. First of all, thank you very much for joining today. It's great to see so many people joining us from different places. Please say hi in the chat as you join, and please feel free to add any comments, questions, or suggestions in the chat as you go through the webinar, and hopefully there'll be time for some questions at the end. All right, so this is what we are going to be doing today. I want to explore, first of all, what we mean by inclusion and some of the differences between integration and inclusion. Then we're going to look at some of the different dimensions of inclusion that constitute inclusive EAL provision. And lastly, we'll look at some organisational strategies for developing more inclusive EAL provision. And ultimately, that's so that hopefully you feel better equipped or more confident to plan for and implement inclusive EAL provision in your context. And most importantly of all, that our multilingual learners feel welcomed, valued, and included in the school environment and therefore can achieve their full potential. And here's a map of the session. And I'm going to start by looking at the differences, different types of inclusion and inclusive practices. So what we see when we visit different schools, both internationally and here in the UK where we're based, is that there are different approaches to working with plurilingual learners. And I'm going to summarize these in a way that have been categorized and identified by Samina Chowdhury in her book, Equitable Education. So the first approach in some schools is that plurilingual learners are segregated. Segregation occurs when plurilingual pupils are taught in a separate environment to their first language or proficient in English peers. And so common examples of this were separate classes that are only for certain groups of pupils, and where they're taught in a separate space using different resources to their peers. In the international school sector, this is often part of a planned intervention or induction period to the school, for example, but it can also be informal and spontaneous. For example, imagine a new arrival entering the school midway through the academic year. They might be placed into a class, and the teacher will, say, ask a teaching assistant to go out of the classroom and teach that child some of the basic literacy or maths or whatever it is they need to be able to catch up with their peers. So it can happen both in a planned way or in a spontaneous way. Other schools integrate plurilingual pupils, and integration occurs when pupils are placed in an existing mainstream class, but there aren't any adjustments for those students. So this means that it's the pupil themselves that must adapt or change. Teaching practices and assessment tasks remain the same, and essentially pupils have to either sink or swim in this approach. So you can imagine that for children who are new to English, for example, that this presents quite a lot of challenges. And other schools are fully inclusive in their provision and practices. And inclusion occurs when all pupils are educated in regular classrooms alongside same-aged peers with appropriate adjustments to the environment, curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Now, these are simplifications of what in most schools can be a very nuanced and combined approach to EAL provision. But the main point is that inclusive practice and pedagogy offers plurilingual learners the same opportunities to succeed academically as their first language English peers. So we're going to examine in more detail the characteristics of inclusive EAL provision, and that will allow us to consider then how that might look in our different contexts. Okay, which brings us on to different dimensions of inclusivity. And I want to start by signposting and recommending to you a book, and it's this book I have with me here, by a group of educators from the University of Cambridge and a couple of other institutions. It was published in 2020, and it's called Language Development and Social Integration of Students with English as an Additional Language. And it forms the main basis for what I'm about to talk about in this section. It's written about the UK context, but there are so many ideas here that are applicable in any multilingual context. And the authors proposed a model of inclusive pedagogy for EAL, which includes 4 dimensions of inclusion, which you can see here. So there are academic, social, linguistic, and attitudinal. By attitudinal, I'm talking about the inclusive attitudes of teachers towards plurilingual learners. Each dimension impacts on the others, but it's teachers' inclusive attitudes that really support and underpin the other 3 dimensions, which is why it appears at the bottom. I'm going to talk about each dimension now in turn, and we'll look at what each dimension involves. So with academic inclusion, we're talking about the mastery of strategies and pedagogical techniques that allow our plurilingual learners to access the curriculum. And these are the strategies that I imagine we are probably most familiar with as EAL professionals, as I can see many of you are. And these are the things that tend to form the basis, I think, of most EAL-oriented staff training. And therefore, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because it's outside the scope of this webinar. And we already have lots of resources on these topics that we've done in previous webinars and that are on our website. But to give you an overview of what we mean when we're talking about academic inclusion, it includes, firstly, providing bilingual support. So that might be in the form of using translation tools, whether online or using dictionaries. It's the use of bilingual materials and resources, for example, texts, using word mats and things like that. And also the use of bilingual teachers and teaching assistants in the classroom as well. It also includes simplifying the learning process. And it's really important to note that by this, I don't mean simplifying or reducing the curricular content. I mean simplifying the way that tasks are presented and organized to make them more linguistically accessible. So for example, in a maths lesson, a teacher wouldn't simplify a maths problem for a new to English learner. They would simplify the instructions to allow them to access the problem. And of course, this involves a lot of the techniques and ideas that I'm sure we're all familiar with, like using visuals, graphic organizers to visually represent and organize concepts, as well as scaffolding tasks by breaking them down into smaller chunks, using graded language, and so on. The third aspect is combining mainstreaming with support in withdrawn classes. And And again, this in some contexts can be quite contentious. Certainly here in the UK, this is, but certainly in general, from an EAL perspective, as an organisation, we would advocate for mainstreaming pupils as early as possible. And the purpose of this is, one, so that pupils do not lose the optimal opportunity for subject matter learning, and secondly, so that they can more quickly bond and integrate with their peers. However, I think it's really important to note that support, withdrawal support, is a valid strategy, but it needs to be done in a purposeful and strategic way that optimizes learning. So, for example, we don't recommend withdrawing learners from subjects such as PE, music, or technology, which are things they can potentially participate in and learn about regardless of their language proficiency. It's going to be more useful if you need to withdraw learners from mainstream classes to choose those lessons which are which have a very high demand in terms of language. So we're talking about language topics such as English, or perhaps maybe taking a slot from another modern language or something like that. Although again, depending on your school and your context, you may take another approach, and that's absolutely valid as well. The fourth aspect is implementing collaborative learning. And we're talking here both on the sort of micro level of things like group work, pair work, peer mediation, for example, the kind of pair and share learning sequences that are very common, which promote discussion and collaboration. And also we're talking about broader techniques such as using project-based learning or kind of these kind of approaches which tend to involve working in groups. And this is really about building confidence and building in practice so that students can get those opportunities to use the language, become familiar with the language, and build their confidence using academic language that may be new to them. And the last point is promoting assessment for learning. And that means using robust and fair initial assessment. For example, not placing students in low ability classes or groups just because they have low English proficiency. It also involves continuous assessment of language proficiency, and ideally that is using assessment tools designed for assessing English use within the curriculum, not assessing general English skills, so that we can inform levels of support and set targets. And for more information about that, please, you can see our website, and we do run regular online courses on EAL assessment as well if you're interested in finding out more. I won't go into any more detail now. So I think these ideas are, in my experience, quite familiar in most international schools that I encounter, and there is at least awareness about the importance of doing these things, even if schools are still working to embed some of these practices. But I think with the other dimensions, they may not be as front of mind when it comes to thinking about EAL provision. So we'll examine these next in a bit more detail. So with linguistic inclusion, this aspect involves decisions on whether and when to use home languages in teaching, and what strategies to use for that and for what purpose. And the sort of context for this is that in English language teaching in the late 20th century in particular, there was a pervading culture that English should be learned without reference to or use of the learner's own language in the classroom. So this is the kind of English only approach. And that's certainly how I was trained when I did my initial English language teacher training, getting on for 20 years ago. And in fact, there's not that much evidence to suggest that an English only approach is beneficial when you compare it to other principled approaches that make use of learners' home languages. Additionally, some English only practices originate understandably in English speaking contexts. So in the UK or the US or Australia or wherever it might be, where assimilation and integration into the culture of the host country and achieving native-like competence was the main goal of language education. But in an international school situation, in most cases, this view is becoming viewed as viewed as outmoded, and educators and policymakers tend to focus on learners being able to use the languages they speak for practical purposes of education or their future careers, without worrying whether it meets an artificial standard of a national variety. The learners don't necessarily need to be able to speak like a native speaker of British English or American English or whatever it might be. And in an international multilingual context, then it really makes sense to celebrate the linguistic repertoire of all the learners and utilize these skills to foster the development of additional languages alongside subject knowledge. So let's explore what that might look like. What we mean by exploiting students' linguistic repertoire. Well, the first thing we might think about is what is described as translanguaging or code switching, although you don't necessarily need to use those terms, I think. This means students should be encouraged to use their home languages when they feel a need to do so, and that multilingualism should be promoted to ensure students don't feel any shame or embarrassment at using their home language. And this is where it's important to understand that language is part of our identity. So it's really important to avoid practices that place shame or embarrassment at using your language, which is part of you. This means allowing and normalizing code switching or language mixing in class so that learners can start saying a sentence in English, for example, but switch to the home language for unknown words. And home language use absolutely shouldn't be punished. And I think it's important to say that English only policies can have actively detrimental effects. Maurice Carder writes about this in his book, and he says that English only policies can send a message that learners and teachers' first languages aren't valued or are inferior. And I think this means avoiding or certainly pushing against whole school English only policies or English only policing. And this isn't the same as saying that we shouldn't expect learners to use English in certain situations, tasks, and activities. That's absolutely valid, but this should be something that is agreed upon, I think, by the teacher or staff member. And there should always be a clear rationale for why this is a English only activity or space. One strategy for doing that, for example, might be having a classroom language policy or contract, where in collaboration with your students, you agree when it is okay to use home language and when it's going to be more helpful to use English. For example, when planning work or making notes, perhaps we allow the use of whatever language students feel most comfortable using. Whilst where it comes to maybe sharing ideas with the group, especially if we're working in a multilingual class situation, the use of English makes sense, doesn't it? Because that's that way everybody can engage and understand. And the second aspect to this is developing home language skills. And again, this is because we know that first language and additional language development are mutually enriching. And because it provides additional support to help students access their learning. Again, this comes down a little bit to kind of ideas and attitudes. So the English only or monolingual approaches that used to be very popular are predicated on an idea that languages exist as these kind of separate entities, these separate bounded entities. But increasingly, research suggests languages interact, are interdependent in both bilingual and plurilingual learners' minds. It's not like there's one bit of your brain that's English, one bit of your brain that's German, and they never sort of connect with each other. This means that language learning then is likely to be more efficient when it is scaffolded onto existing linguistic knowledge. This is, of course, Vygotsky's famous theory, for those of you who've studied learning development. And in this case, the existing linguistic knowledge is the students' home languages. It's also it's also going to make learning more efficient when teachers consciously raise students' awareness of similarities and differences between languages in the classroom. So we can note that linguistic inclusion can be practiced in an explicit or an implicit way, but these strategies are not always obvious to the learners themselves. So it's going to be really important to raise students' awareness of benefits to using their whole language repertoire to support their learning. We need to tell them why it's helpful to them and when it's helpful to them. Teachers, school leaders, and parents will benefit from teachers, school leaders, and parents will benefit from becoming more aware or reminding themselves of the benefits of exploiting students' linguistic toolkits. And I appreciate what I'm talking about is quite theoretical at the moment, but in the next couple of slides, we'll look at some more practical ways that schools can develop home languages. So at school, then, it's really important to ensure that home languages are openly discussed and valued in the classroom. For example, you might have a home language display to show which languages are spoken within the class. You can ask the pupils to give home language presentations where they can present or teach a poem, story, or song in their home language, and then maybe explain what it means in English. And allow opportunities for pupils to use their home language, for example, discuss ideas in their home language, then feed back to the wider group in English, or they can read a text in their home language and then answer comprehension questions in English about the text. And what we talked about earlier, which is allowing that kind of language mixing so that learners can start saying a sentence in English, but it's okay to switch to the home language if they don't know what the word is. And I think that's especially going to be useful in a sort of bilingual setting where everyone in the group shares a home language. Where you have groups of learners who share a home language in your school, you could consider setting up home language conversation clubs, for example, where learners can come and practice using their home language in a more sort of informal or social or semi-structured way. And of course, if you're able to provide access to age-appropriate books and materials in pupils' home languages. Now, of course, not all of these strategies are going to be possible depending on your specific context. So it's all about doing what you can and picking out those strategies and ideas that are going to work for you. We also need to think about home language development at home. So again, there are some things we can do here. The first one is educate our parents, basically highlight the value of multilingualism to parents. We know from research that the maintenance of the first language has been found to accelerate the process of learning an additional language. So let's get that across to parents, whether that's in meetings, or you might want to include that information in newsletters or during induction, or where it's often to sort of continually repeat this kind of information so that they get the idea. Communicate to parents that pupils can still learn the curriculum content in their first language and encourage them to help their children to do this. For example, parents can read books at home with children in the first language and use their first language to help their children with homework by giving explanations, clarifying questions, or discussing the meaning of texts, even if the text and the content topic itself is in English. In an international context, many parents are, very well educated and they will have the knowledge in their own languages about these topics, but they may not have them in English. So it's fine for them to use their home languages. You may want to keep parents informed of topics being covered in class, and that gives parents the chance to source home language versions. So giving parents lists of popular fiction texts that are being used in school ahead of time, for example. Because we know that children who are familiar with books and stories in their home languages will find it easier to access them in English. And we can encourage parents and extended family to engage in storytelling in home languages. These can be fact or fiction. So, one of the most powerful things is getting parents or grandparents to tell stories from their own childhoods, for example. And promoting shared reading in the home language as well is a really great way of supporting oral language development and literacy. So, encouraging parents to read aloud to their child in their home language, we know is an effective strategy. I think people recommend around 15 minutes per day, but I think any opportunity to do that is going to be beneficial. And lastly, encourage parents who are less confident with their English to use their home language and discourage any English only practices at home, especially where parents don't have a strong grasp of English themselves. This may be less of an issue in an international setting. It certainly happens quite commonly in the UK, unfortunately. And remind parents that children need to be surrounded by fluent and confident language users in order to build strong relationships and feel comfortable at home. So using the home language is likely to be the best way to achieve this. Okay, so we move on to thinking about social inclusion. And this kind of touches on what we were just talking about, doesn't it? Which is that we know that feeling accepted and safe is central to successful language acquisition. And social inclusion can be defined as the ability to interact with, make friends with, and be accepted by peers. And we know this is closely related to learning and attainment. Essentially, learners who are anxious, worried, or scared due to their language proficiency are not going to be effective learners in any subject or situation. So we need to address that. And again, there are various methods we can use to do that. For example, buddying systems where we pair up children together. Buddying and allocating roles such as young interpreter, can greatly enhance social inclusion for new arrivals, especially those with low proficiency in English. And pairing students with a same language buddy, if that's an option, or with a first language English or proficient English speaker to be a helper, can also facilitate inclusion and help build connections and friendships. Celebrations of cultural heritage and an inclusion of diverse cultural references in the curriculum are also an important way students can feel more socially included. History, for example, lends itself easily to explorations of different cultures with other subjects. Excuse me. With other subjects, you can make sure that examples are culturally diverse and representative of your students' backgrounds. So, it's taken into account both the cultures of the students who are in your class and also exposing them to other cultures outside their experiences too. I think the thing to be wary of here is only focusing on kind of superficial exploration of cultural issues. So, try and link it in some meaningful way to your curricular topic and avoid the sort of more superficial issues, sometimes called the 3 Fs: food, flag, and festivals. And look for those opportunities to bring in examples and case studies that reflect the cultural diversity of your learners. And this integrated approach to teaching culture alongside curricular topics, I think, works really well with inquiry-based curricula. So the International Baccalaureate, PYP, MYP programs, for example, and any sort of project-based learning kind of programs that you might be following. Because this allows learners to do things like research their own country's involvement or connection to the topic being studied, and can be quite powerful. Something else we can do is simply provide regular opportunities for students to interact. It's very simple, but obviously this links to what we talked about in academic inclusion about providing those opportunities for collaboration with other students, but it's also interaction with the teachers. So reminding teachers to talk to every learner at least once during a lesson if they can, even if that learner is going through a silent period because they're still at the early stages of learning English. I've also heard of schools who've kind of extended this practice to include parents and family. So, for example, inviting parents with the same home language to a coffee morning and things like that. I want to give a quick shout out to a lovely resource that I think that can help with introducing some of the ideas we've just discussed around linguistic and social inclusivity, and that's the We Are Multilingual website. This was set up by the University of Cambridge. It was originally for UK schools, but as I say, a lot of the content there is very applicable in any multilingual situation. And it has free lesson plans and ideas for introducing these ideas to your learners. So I'd recommend having a look at that if you want to kind of get a sense of what you can practically do in the classroom to build students' linguistic inclusivity and understanding of it. And finally, then, we'll look at teachers' inclusive attitudes. And this dimension is perhaps the most important, but it's also the hardest to influence because it's potentially about shaping people's mindsets and beliefs and ideologies. Well, what can we do? Well, the way that the authors of the book talk about this is the first thing we can do is to delabel the plurilingual learner. And basically, this means avoiding pigeonholing or othering plurilingual learners in a particular way. And by this, I mean things like referring to EAL learners using non-inclusive language. For example, there's a phrase that we tend to avoid, which is quite common, is learner with EAL. And to me, that doesn't sound very inclusive because it kind of sounds like having English as an additional language is a medical condition or a problem, something like that, to be cured. I've also heard teachers say things like, you know, he or she is an EAL. That's kind of dehumanizing this kind of language. And of course, they don't necessarily mean it in that way at all. They're using it kind of innocently as a sort of shorthand way to refer to that learner. But if teachers have a inclusive mindset, what this means is they conceptualize the problems that plurilingual learners face as variations of the problems that all learners might face at some stage of their schooling. So this means at a basic level, understanding that not speaking English isn't a deficiency or to be cured or a problem to be solved. It's a skill to be developed like any other. You know, I think of the example of when a child joins kindergarten or joins our early years program at school, we don't label them as, oh, this is an illiterate learner. This person doesn't even know how to read. Oh, this is terrible. What a big problem. Are we going to have to give them special provision? No, we take that learner and we teach them and we build them up and we gradually help them learn how to read and write because we understand that they're entering the school without that skill and we need to build it up. The second aspect is valuing plurilingual learners, and this means thinking of plurilingual pupils as assets and catalysts for learnings. This links to what we talked about in terms of cultural sharing and being open and encouraging and accepting of other ideas and cultures, and also believing that working with plurilingual learners is developmental and enriching for teachers. And again, this may involve, to begin with, a little bit of messaging. You may have to explicitly say, well, look, this is helpful to you for X, Y, and Z reason. If you are doing EAL specific training with teachers, one thing I think can help here is by making explicit links between those techniques and strategies that work really well in the classroom for all learners to increase learning. Talking about things like active learning techniques, such as collaboration tasks, providing thinking time, these kind of interactive activities. These work really well and have shown to improve learning outcomes for all learners, regardless of their first language, but they're also really, really effective for plurilingual learners because they give them extra support. So it's finding those links and making that clear to staff. Now, these are not easy things to magically get staff to think. It's a slow process. So we're going to look in the next section at some organizational strategies that might help with building a school culture that fosters and promotes these ways of seeing learners who use EAL. But first, I just want to sort of sound a word of caution, I suppose. So consider this quote from Leung and Kreis. It says, "Inclusive pedagogies, unless properly resourced with appropriate teacher expertise and knowledge, may fail the very students they set out to support." So let's just unpack and clarify this a little bit. In schools where inclusion is understood to be simply about placing learners using EAL into the mainstream classroom, integrating them into the same physical settings with other learners, but where there is no appropriate language support, and teachers do not have the awareness of the distinct EAL pedagogy and effective EAL learning approaches, plurilingual learners can become excluded in the inclusive mainstream classroom. And I'll give you a powerful example of this, which comes from an article written by Chen, and it's called "Language Support for Emergent Bilinguals in English Mainstream Schools." And she observes the behavior of primary pupils using EAL, and she sees them to be alone and withdrawn. And she comments that they are quiet, silent, left out, and unable to participate due to the language barrier. She looks at some of the students' own experiences, and one of the pupils in her own diary calls herself sad at heart. And I think for most of us as educators, that's hard to hear, isn't it? And we need to be really aware that mainstream inclusion can become harshly exclusionary due to insufficient language support. And instead of being included, pupils become withdrawn. And that results in their confidence plummeting and lots of other negative outcomes that, of course, we want to avoid. So again, this is a really important message for our school leaders, and so that they can understand the importance of an inclusive approach to EAL. Okay, let's think about some of the organizational strategy we might want to use here. These are all quite broad, but with this kind of approach, it starts from the top. So we're going to think about how you would build an ethos that is linguistically inclusive at your school. And I guess one of the ways this gets framed often is that all teachers are language teachers. Now, I kind of like this phrase as a language teacher myself, but I can also understand that if I wasn't a language teacher, this might feel quite threatening. So I'm not always 100% convinced of its use as a slogan, but all teachers are language teachers. And I think what's important here is that this doesn't mean that all teachers need to be language specialists or language experts, but they need to recognize that part of their responsibility, a basic aspect of their job, is ensuring that their learners have the linguistic tools they need to learn and be successful. And that fundamentally, as the class teacher or the subject teacher, they are the person that holds the knowledge of how language is used in their topic in their classroom. So they are really the person that has to convey that to the learners, of course, with support from EAL specialists as well. And I think a good place to start here is to create an inclusive language policy that outlines your school's values and approach to multilingualism and what those values look like in practice. And I think a lot of schools, international schools in my experience, are pretty good at having that inclusive values in their mission statement, but they're not always as good at actually explaining what those things might look like. So you might want to include in those policies the kind of behaviors and practices that you expect your staff to see, because that will provide that kind of platform, and it's leading from the top, hopefully. If you want to know more about that, we have an EAL coordinator course coming up in September, which goes into more detail about creating an effective language policy. Another strategy is CPD, or continuing professional development, and making sure the staff have access to appropriate professional development. And there's two ways of thinking about this. Firstly, teachers need to have the knowledge of language and multilingualism. And this is really what we were talking about earlier in our dimensions of inclusivity, wasn't it? And this is the why. Why do we need to be linguistically inclusive in our teaching? And the second aspect is awareness of how to deliver pedagogy for plurilingual pupils. So this is the how. So we have the why is it useful, and how do we do it? And again, we haven't got time here to to go into all the details of how, but these are the kind of things that we always are doing webinars on. And I know I can already see people sharing fantastic ideas, and there are loads of useful resources out there on the internet. Another organizational strategy to promote, if you can, is to try to plan for and ensure time for collaborative planning. This means allowing EAL specialists time to work with subject teachers to help them identify where language support may be needed, and to help them and to share strategies and ideas. I appreciate if you're a teacher, this might sound frustrating because that's not your decision. But again, I'm really speaking here to school leaders and people who have those decision-making roles. So if you're a teacher, advocate for this kind of collaborative planning. It doesn't have to be, a huge part of someone's weekly schedule. For example, it could be a meeting a couple of times a semester. It's often very helpful during planning for the year. So it might just be when you're planning your scheme of work for the year that there's time for an EAL specialist to sit down with a subject teacher or the class teacher and just think, oh, well, that topic there might need some language support. Have you considered, and they can help provide the ideas and strategies that may help in those situations. Again, this is a topic that you could do an entire series of webinars on, and it's something to explore in more depth, but this is just a sort of broad suggestion. The next thing is making sure your EAL staff are treated with the same professional respect as other teachers. And again, I'm speaking here to school leadership, not to those of you who are EAL teachers. And it may sound odd to say this, but I have first-hand experience of seeing schools where there is a separation. Their EAL staff are segregated. They work in a separate office. They have separate contracts. They're completely different to the mainstream teachers in the school, and they don't interact with each other. And I think this is really, really problematic, and it can be very, very detrimental to the learning that takes place in a school. And this is, of course, linked to recruitment policy as well. So it's really important to ensure recruitment of properly qualified EAL staff. And again, we're thinking here about using equitable and inclusive recruitment methods. For example, recruiting people based on their skills and ability to do the required job, not on features like nationality or first language. And for example, I mean, avoiding using terms like native speaker as a shorthand for things that have nothing to do with someone's first language. And again, this is something that you do see. It's becoming less common, fortunately, but you do see it with some schools where they may advertise for a native speaker, and what they actually mean is somebody who's proficient in the language, someone who understands the culture of the English-speaking country, and someone who is an effective teacher. And actually, none of those things require English being your first language. So anyway, helping staff understand why that terminology may be unhelpful, may be not inclusive is going to be important. So finally then, something that we might want to think about is evaluating inclusive practice in our school. So what we're talking about here is being able to measure how inclusive your EAL provision is. And there's no one simple way of doing this, but there are some areas you may want to focus on. The first thing you could do perhaps is look at any observation criteria that are used for evaluation of teaching and learning in your school. So do your teacher observation criteria include reference to linguistically, socially, and academically inclusive practice? And if not, where could you maybe include those? You might also want to think about resources. So when selecting resources or texts, consider whether or not they align with your school's values and mission statement. Usually most international schools have some kind of statement along the line of helping learners become successful global citizens, or sharing international values and things like that. So do your resources purposely support students to become these global citizens? I'm going to show you a list here taken from a really helpful article that I found popped up on social media recently. And again, I can share you you can probably Google it, but we will also share the link with you by email after the webinar. This was written by 2 American educators, so it's sort of US context that they were speaking about, and they weren't talking specifically at all about EAL provision, but more general, how we can assess critically resources we're using in our classrooms. And they asked some really interesting questions, and I just picked out a few there because I thought they were really helpful. So supporting citizens to become global citizens, supporting students to become global citizens. Do the resources reflect your learners' cultures? Do they give them insight into new cultures? And do they potentially harm students, especially any learners you might have with marginalized identities? So again, you could create your own simple resource checklist, and if you explore the article that this comes from, it provides a checklist that you can use to do that. We've already spoken about recruitment, but it's going to be very important to evaluate how inclusive is your recruitment process at your school. And again, I appreciate if you're a teacher, this may not be something you have any influence over, but it's the kind of thing that we can advocate for, at least. So that means avoiding linguistically discriminatory terminology in job descriptions and job adverts, for example. And it's also going to be useful to evaluate your admissions processes. So for example, do you collect information about home languages and what home languages a child uses and how proficient they are? Does your testing provide EAL learners a fair chance to show their content and subject knowledge as well as their language proficiency? And is it a fair test? So if you've got a test that is meant to test your students' listening skills, are you requiring them to speak and write down lengthy answers to a listening in response to a listening text? Because that's actually testing their, as well as their listening, is testing their reading and writing. So having for a listening tests answers that are ticking boxes or matching pictures or something that's less linguistically demanding in terms of productive skills. And if you're interested in exploring these kind of things in more depth for your school about basically auditing the kind of processes at your school and whether or not they are inclusive and helpful for EAL practitioners, I just wanted to make you aware of our Language Results International accreditation program, which we recently started. and it focuses solely on EAL provision for international schools, and it's designed to help schools develop and improve EAL provision. And you can find more information about that on our website if you want to. Okay, I'm going to bring things to a close now because I suspect there might be some questions. I'm going to share with you this slide as well, which has some of the key references that I've referred to. But we're also going to send out a email with a list of these references with the recording of the webinar as well. So don't worry about taking notes on that right now. And we'll also hopefully include links to some of the resources I've mentioned as well. Okay, Shaka, do you have, are there any questions that have been submitted during the
You have
webinar?
some questions. Yeah, well, first of all, Tom, thanks for your information-packed presentation. We do have a few questions. I'm just going through the chat. We had one from earlier, and that was on translanguaging. What would you recommend teachers do once students have written an essay in their first language? For students with more proficiency, the participant suggested it would be good for students to translate some words at least. But what about for those with zero English? What do the students or teachers do in that case after the students have written the piece in their home language?
That's a really good question, isn't it? I think it would probably be unhelpful, as I think was mentioned, to translate a whole text for a child who's still learning. They're not going to be able to do that. So I suppose there's a number of possible approaches. I mean, they could use technology to maybe help them translate it into English, and perhaps they could use that as a model to create their own response. If they're a bit older, I think that could be an approach where they have the ability to sort of evaluate critically something. That might help them at least. A sort of machine translation might help them at least see what they've written, how it might look in English. But then what's going to be important is, of course, it won't be perfect. If you do that, there will be all kinds of problems with perhaps vocabulary and structure and things that might need to be addressed. So it would be then maybe giving them a list of criteria that they can measure that translation against, and so they can kind of edit the translation, if you like. Perhaps that could work. If they're a bit higher level or a bit older and they've got the cognitive skills for that kind of task. Otherwise, I think it might be shrinking the text down and just giving them a small bit of it to translate to in a chunk, perhaps.
Yeah, I think
what do you think?
a good point you made is depending on the age of the child, I would say. The older students might be cognitively, better placed to, for example, compare their text with a model answer or one of their classmates' answers, for example. I think focusing on key vocabulary, I think even learners who have zero or nearly zero English should be encouraged to record and learn some key vocabulary or phrases around the topic that they've been writing on. So that could be a good start, possibly.
Yeah, I think so. I think using models, I think being realistic about what they can and can't produce, it's tricky, isn't it? Because it depends really what the function of them writing the essay. Because if it's an exam question, for example, obviously that's going to be different to if it's an essay that they're just writing for learning purposes to summarize a topic. If they're just summarizing a topic or an idea, it's valid to not really have a translation because it's about the learning that they get from that, the content learning.
Yes, and Rachel in the chat has suggested maybe drawing a picture that links to the writing and labeling it. Again, the labels would then be translated.
Absolutely, and that's sort of for kind of maybe the primary level and things like that. That's going to be very powerful using using kind of visual scaffolding and sort of translating what they can, perhaps keywords as well, choosing the keywords, or asking them perhaps what are the important words in this text you've written, and translating those into English would be a good place to perhaps start. And then as they get more confident, you might be, okay, choose the important sentences in your essay and maybe work, build it up, the sentence, and then move to a paragraph and then build it slowly upwards. So I think having that scaffolding can help.
Yes, I think we have also another suggestion, maybe asking a more advanced student with the same home language to translate and explain the general idea as a possibility. I think, using buddies who have the same home language, if that's an option, is always a good approach, isn't it? Yeah. Well, we've got more questions. The book that you mentioned, Tom, by Elwyn Crisfield,
yes,
Principles for Planning and EAL Aware Curriculum. It's a chapter from a book, isn't it? The question is, has it been published and is it available anywhere? I think I've got a copy of the book. It's from the Research Ed Guide to English as an Additional Language, isn't it?
It is, yes.
I don't know if anyone can see, I've got the blurred background, but the book has been published and is available online. Or to purchase online.
It's quite recent. I think it was last year it came out. So yeah, it's quite new. Again, that's not in my list of references, but we can add it to, and we run out of space on there, but we can add it to that list. And so you
we'll send it out with the recording. It's a very good book on EAL provision.
Lots of useful stuff in it.
Okay, well, we've got go on.
Sorry, there's a question in the chat, but have you got anything else?
We've got several questions. I think there was one about, is there an online community for EAL teachers to share resources and ideas?
That's a good question. I
think someone did suggest freed.com with 3 E's.
I know there's an EAL coordinators group on Facebook, and it's called EAL Coordinators UK, but I know that loads of international school staff are members of it as well, because it's just has lots of useful stuff for everybody. I don't know of any personally, but it would be a great idea, wouldn't it? Maybe start one up.
And another question, or was there one that you saw and wanted to answer, Tom, in the chat?
Well, just to find, there was a question about advice for international schools considering an English-only policy in corridors, and asking, is there any research to suggest this wouldn't be beneficial in international context? And I think the short answer is no. I don't think there's any research. I mean, I don't know for sure, but there's very limited research in general on international school context, just because the logistics of doing educational research in international schools is quite complicated, and they're just, especially for things like this that aren't directly related to the classroom practice, I would imagine there's very little. What we can point to them towards is the research that shows that being able to use all your languages is really beneficial for language development in general. So being able to build, use English and your home language is beneficial both from a linguistic development point of view, but also from a social development point of view. And I think it's really important as well to make it clear language is people's identity, and so to deny them the ability to express that identity is, I think, potentially problematic. I do understand that in certain cultures, obviously, there's going to be very different approaches to rules and individual freedoms and things like that. So it has to be taken into account with the school culture. But I just think it's trying to make schools understand that it may not be helpful, and certainly trying to sort of guide them away from punitive approaches. I think it's fine to say something like, encourage students to speak English in the school corridors. By all means, encourage them, but don't make it some kind of rule. So it's a difficult one, isn't it? Or maybe you can, maybe they have certain periods of time where it's okay, this is English only time. We've got English where you can speak English to your friends and practice your English, but also give them time to use their home language, so that there is something there. but yeah, it's maybe trying to find a compromise, but it can be difficult, I know, depending on the context you're working in.
Right. Thanks, Tom. And I'm afraid this brings us nearly to the end of our webinar. Before we finish, I just wanted, as a reminder, we will send a recording of the webinar and a list of the resources mentioned within the next 48 hours. So keep an eye out on your email inbox. And I also wanted to let you know that we've got courses coming up in the new academic year. You can see the list here. I think of particular interest might be the EAL coordinators course, which is about organising impact for EAL provision, and which starts on the 20th of September. All the details about our upcoming courses are on our website. And we will also be adding more free webinars to the program for the new academic year. So keep an eye out. If you would like to be emailed about any new courses, webinars, resources, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website. I will share the link in the chat just now. Other than that, thank you very much for taking part in today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Goodbye.